Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this how-to, we're going to make some complex components in Figma using auto layout. Here in Figma, we have some starter components that we'll use, as well as some design reference to work from. In terms of the components that we're starting with, we have our color palette, which is already vetted for accessibility in terms of having sufficient color contrast. We have our typography specs, an image watermark icon, a chevron icon, as well as some buttons and links that we'll be using. These buttons are actually dynamic and use auto layout themselves, and I have a dedicated how-to on creating these buttons if you'd like to check that out. Our design reference is based on a past how-to that depended on frames with layout constraints to achieve all of these different variations that we see here. And this required a lot of manual and tedious work to replicate some elements and also show and hide various things so we could accommodate all the variations of these layouts. But now with auto layout in Figma, this whole process is going to be so much simpler and easier. So to begin, let's start by creating this card that has all these potential sub-elements in different combinations. The first thing we can start with is our typography. So I'm going to hit T for the text tool and type out the discovery process. Selecting this text, let's assign our title text style as well as a birch color fill. Hitting T again, let's add another text field. This time I'm going to paste in this body copy that we see here for the card content. So with that pasted in, we want to make sure the copy default text style is in place, as well as that same birch color fill. Moving on, let's drag in an instance of a birch color button, as well as a link of a similar color style. So we have link birch, and for the desktop sizing, let's drag that in place. And the last thing is we'll make use of our image watermark and that chevron icon. While we're here, let's change the fill of this chevron to be birch as well, just so we can see it while we're working on things. All right, now let's bring some order to all of this mess that we've created. The first thing I want to start with is considering the overall sizing of the card component. So the target size I want to go for is 360 pixels in width. In order to achieve this, we should adjust the width of our body copy to accommodate for the padding, so we hit that target 360 pixels. So starting out in the width, let's type 360 and we'll subtract out 32 pixels of left and right padding that we'll want to have. So total, let's subtract 64 from this, and that'll give us a final width of 296. Now for our card title, we can just drag this so that it wraps to 2 lines for now, so that way we know it'll fit within the constraints of the card. I'm going to drag this icon into place temporarily, and we'll address its layout in just a moment. Same thing with this button and link. We'll handle these once we start adding actual layouts here. So the first thing I want to address is this pairing of the card title with its icon. And if we look at our design reference, this is a variation where the whole card is clickable and this title is acting as a link. So selecting our card and our icon, we can introduce our first auto layout layer. We'll use Shift A, and we'll see that we added an auto layout. With this frame, let's call this the card header. And digging into its layout settings, we don't want any padding, and we want the space between these elements to be 16 pixels. This is going to be a horizontal layout, so that's looking good. And let's open this up. We can rename this layer to be the card title and make sure both of these elements are aligned to the vertical center. That's looking good. I want this card header to have the same outer dimensions as our body copy. So we hit a width of 296. And here our overall width is dynamic and it's ending up at 277. So what we'll need to do is adjust the width of this title so that way we hit that overall width of 296. And what that means is we need to add 19 pixels to the card title so we hit that overall width. Now if we check out the calculated width of our card header, it matches that of the body. That's looking good. Let's now focus on the layout between this header as well as the body copy. So I'm going to rename this to be the card description. And let's drag it up in our layers so we can select both of these. Hitting Shift and A, we're going to add another auto layout. And we can rename this layer to be card text. Now, automatically, there is 0 padding for both horizontal and vertical directions. And I want the spacing between items to be 16 pixels. One thing to check on at this stage is what happens if we disable this icon, because we have a lot of variations where the icon isn't shown. And right now you can see that this card header is centering within the card text auto layout. So to fix this, we want to make sure this is set to left alignment. And that way, as we enable or disable this icon, the layout doesn't shift unexpectedly. With that in place, we can keep adding elements to this card. So let's address our image that we'll have here. And you can see that it has a background that we'll need to create. In order to achieve that background, let's add a frame around this layer. So I'm going to hit Control or Command plus Alt or Option and G to create a frame. Let's rename this frame Card Image and give it a background color. So I'm going to turn on this fill layer and let's just sample this placeholder gray for now. I want the width of the image to be 360 pixels to match the overall width of our card, and the height is going to be 192 per our design reference here. With those dimensions established, we can use our alignment tools to horizontally and vertically center the watermark, as well as setting its constraints to center and center. The next consideration is grouping the text with either a button or a link. So we can select all 3 of these layers and once again use Shift-A to add an auto layout. Let's call this frame Card Body. At this level, we want 32 pixels of left and right padding, and we'll also want 32 pixels of vertical padding to achieve the spacing between the image and the card body, as well as this padding on the bottom edge of our card. And the spacing between elements, we want to set that to 32 as well. Now, obviously, we don't want both a button and a link, so as we turn either of them on or off, the layout automatically adapts. We'll leave this button turned on for now. And that padding is looking good. The last thing to do to finalize our card component at this stage is to use Shift-A once more for the final auto layout layer. And we'll rename this to be Card. At this layer, we can actually bring in our fill color. So we have this lighter charcoal value. This will have a border radius of 4 pixels. And we'll also want to add a drop shadow effect for the dark theme. So our card is turning out pretty good here. We've basically styled this first variation, which is kind of a maximum use case of all the different elements coming together. And if we zoom out a bit, we can see how this auto layout component can now achieve all of these different variations without having to do a bunch of tedious work. So for example, this first use case is already covered. The second use case we could definitely achieve with a separate button component. This button is using auto layout as well, so it's only going to be as wide as it needs to be. And that actually reminds me, we should update this text to be learn more, just to match our reference here. But if you wanted a full width button, you could definitely bring in another component for that. For this next variation, we simply turn off the card image and all of the text tucks into the top edge of the card. And then we trade out our button for a link. And this we should also update with the text to match our design. So we'll say learn more on this as well. Now this link is not using auto layout. So you can see that the text wants to wrap to a new line since the component doesn't have enough space for it. And this is basically just a frame with some layout constraints. So to adjust this, we want to use Control or Command plus the right arrow to gradually increase the width of the component until all of that text fits on the same line. With that solved for, we can easily trade out a button for a text link as needed. So this next variation is taken care of. Continuing down the line, we have some variations that feature the card image more prominently. So the first one would be card image with no description. And instead of a link, we have a button. And so that's looking good. And then the last one takes advantage of that chevron icon we added earlier. So this one would have the icon, no description, and no button. So you can see the power of auto layout in these more complex components. And sometimes it's kind of hard to wrap around how many auto layout layers are needed to achieve different spacing values between elements. But once you get it set up, it's super flexible and makes for a much more adaptable component. So with all of those use cases verified, let's go ahead and componentize this outermost card layer. We can use Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K, and we can get this componentized. I'm going to restore it back to that kind of original or first use case, just as a reference. And from here, we can drag out an instance of this card, and we're going to talk about retheming it for a light theme. So similar to all other Figma components, what's great about this is we get all of that inheritance of the spacing and the functionality, but it's easy to restyle it for different color themes as needed. And one thing I'm seeing here as a good illustration of that point is the card layout auto-generated some spacing between items of 4 pixels. So in order to fix that, we just have to go to the master instance, select the card, and change that spacing between items to 0. And you can see that both instances updated immediately. So now everything is perfect. Selecting the second instance, let's make sure it's spaced correctly in our design files. We can now begin restyling all the colors of this for a light theme. So the background of the card itself is going to be birch. Instead of elevation 1 for the dark theme, we'll trade that out for light. Going further into our elements here, we have this birch button. We want to swap out this instance for a charcoal variation. If we turn on our link for a moment, we want this to also be charcoal. So instead of default for birch, we want charcoal desktop default. And then our card text, the description, this darkest charcoal color. And in the header, we want both the fill of the icon as well as the text of the title to be that same dark gray. So just double checking the icon looks good. And now you can see that we've rethemed this final component for a light variation. So we can recomponentize this with Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K. And we'd call this light. So there's a separate variation there. I'd probably want to rename this first instance to be dark. That way we can quickly swap between instances. So if we were to drag out a third card, we have this instance panel, and we can just trade it out for dark as needed. So with all that work complete, we now have a really flexible and adaptable card component that uses auto layout to its fullest potential. We can swap out for different use cases as needed, and we only have one parent component for each theme, so we don't have to go through and create tons of variations that we all have to manually maintain. So that does it for this how-to. There's going to be many more how-tos coming out that focus on auto layout and really explore all of the possibilities that this feature unlocks. So thank you so much for watching. Be sure to keep a lookout for the next Build UX how-to.